Good morning. I'm Bill Hamblett, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings at the U.S. Naval Institute. This episode of the Proceedings podcast is brought to you by Blue Cross Blue Shield Vision Coverage. What makes good vision coverage? Things like fully covered vision care exams for all members, access to over 125,000 independent providers and national retailers. That's why you should choose Blue Cross Blue Shield FEP Vision. Plans start as low as $12. See what we can do for you at bcbsfepvision.com. All right. Welcome back. This is the second episode of the podcast today. And in October at the Naval Institute, the U.S. Naval Academy, we co-hosted a conference in the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center that was titled The Russia-China Partnership, a Challenge to the New World Order. We had an all-star cast of speakers and panelists, including my guest today. The Honorable Randall Shriver is chairman of the board of the Project 2049 Institute. He served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs from January 2018 through December 2019. Prior to his confirmation as Assistant Secretary, Mr. Shriver was a founding partner of Armitage International LLC, a consulting firm that specializes in international business development and strategies. He was also a founder of the Project 2049 Institute and served as its president and CEO. Previously, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. From 2001 to 2003, he served as Chief of Staff and Senior Policy Advisor to the Deputy Secretary of State. And in the 1990s, he worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, including as the senior officer responsible for the day-to-day management of U.S. bilateral relations with the People's Liberation Army and the bilateral security and military relationships with Taiwan. So great insights to a lot of things that are happening today. And prior to his civilian service, I got to say, because he's one of us, he served as an active duty Navy intelligence officer. Mr. Secretary, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
All right, so I want to start with current events because, boy, there's a lot happening in China right now. So large protests erupted in multiple cities around China over the weekend, certainly the largest protests since COVID. A lot of them were calling for an end to the COVID lockdowns. Surprised to see the size of these rallies, especially just a month or so after Xi Jinping secured his third term. So what's your take on what's happening in China today?
Well, it's not unusual for there to be public protests, but they tend to be very localized. The unusual thing about these protests is they are apparently nationwide, and there is a unifying concern and issue, which is, as you mentioned, the COVID lockdowns. So this has to be of pretty significant concern to the CCP leadership, and we're seeing them respond in that fashion. They've closed some of the universities. They've closed off some of the major streets that have been places where the public has carried out some of these protests. So it's got to be of concern to the leadership, and they're in a tough spot because these COVID zero policies and the lockdowns have been so severe and have carried on for so long. But Xi Jinping has declared this approach a success. So how do they get out of that cul-de-sac? They've got to find a way out. Their vaccines aren't great. The elderly population in China is not well vaccinated, and it's strangling the economy. But so far, the leader has signaled that this is the right approach. So politically, it's difficult for them to back out of that cul-de-sac. But I think they've got to do it if they want to, return to some common stability there in China.
From my reading of it, it sounds like there was an apartment fire with 10 or so people died in that fire, and there's some speculation, maybe stronger than speculation, that the COVID zero, the lockdown, the fact that they kind of lock people into these apartment buildings these days was cause for the deaths, if not the fire itself. People couldn't get out of the building or couldn't get out of the building fast enough. Have you heard any more details on that?
Not a lot more details, but you're exactly right. That's what spread into Chinese social media and was picked up by some of the Western media, a fire in Urumqi, which, of course, in Xinjiang. So there's all kinds of security protocols in place in Xinjiang. So it could be a combination of the COVID lockdown and other security procedures that made it difficult for people to get out of that building. But certainly tragic, and seems to have caught the imagination of many of the Chinese people.
Yeah, I want to ask you, just because you've spent so much time in your career focused on China, and we hear so much about, the Great Firewall of China and China's ability to control the internet, to control, social media, and this is not just localized to Xinjiang, as you said, where it started, but it's erupted across multiple cities, major cities, and universities. So I'm curious how. If you have any insights into how the protesters are organizing or perhaps getting that message out, and how long it would take the Chinese government to find them all and crack down, because that's got to be going on, right?
Yeah. So the ability to control the internet is still limited, even though the Chinese are very sophisticated and use sophisticated algorithms to search for particular phrasing and words on the internet. First of all, there's a need for rapid response when something like this occurs, and they generally can't, even with all their capabilities, respond so fast that the word is completely contained. And number two, the Chinese citizens have gotten quite creative about getting around restrictions and controls, using code words and phrases that refer to certain things that are well understood among the Chinese citizens, but don't necessarily catch the immediate attention of the censors. So there's a reason Winnie the Pooh is not allowed on the internet in China, and that's because for a while that was a term that was used to describe Xi Jinping. It's a bit of a humorous anecdote, but there's a serious point behind it, which is, as good as the Chinese Communist Party is, there's a lot of creativity among the Chinese people to spread the word, and there's old-fashioned mechanisms as well. I mean, calling people out to the street corner is still in fashion in some of these major population centers, and a lot of it is word of mouth and relative to relative, friend to friend.
Got it. Interesting stuff. So after you left the Pentagon at the end of 2019, you went back to the Project 2049 Institute. A lot of our listeners are familiar with the year 2049 being the 100th anniversary of Communist Party rule in China. So what's the mission and focus of the 2049 Institute?
Well, ultimately, it's to support U.S. policymakers and those that want the U.S. well-positioned to secure the future of a free and open Indo-Pacific. But our particular role in that is to study and analyze the Chinese Communist Party, the PLA, and their modernization efforts. And we apply a particular methodology of using Chinese language capability to look at open source materials, as well as pretty sophisticated analysis. We have very accomplished members from the IC who've retired and understand at least the basics of analysis. And so combining Chinese language and analytical capability, even though it's open source and unclassified, we think we still provide a pretty sophisticated line of products and events. And I think we've been able to demonstrate that the Chinese have ambitions, have aspirations that are in conflict with our own, and that they are building the capabilities, particularly in the PLA, to pursue those interests and aspirations, and that we're seeing the implementation of all of that unfold in near real time. We've seen it in the South China Sea. We've seen it with respect to their ambitions toward Taiwan and in the East China Sea. So these are things we're studying as they're happening. And so for us to be able to provide support to the U.S. policy community, it requires a lot of vigilance, and that's what we do.
Yeah, that's great. So our readers and our podcast listeners are really quite well versed on China's military buildup and modernization, particularly the speed of it over the last decade. They understand the term anti-access area denial. They've heard retired Captain Jim Fennell talk about the PLA Navy, the Coast Guard, the Maritime Militia, those efforts to intimidate regional neighbors and assert sovereignty in the South China Sea. They understand that 2049, the 100th anniversary coming of the CCP rule. When you talk to audiences about China, about Taiwan and East Asia, what are the most pressing points you make?
I think number one is that the stakes are high, that we're talking about a near peer, a great power rival that has ambitions to undermine the free and open order in the Indo-Pacific, which is the most critical region for us. If you look at population size, economic interests, military activities, most of the objective measures that matter would suggest this is the most important region to us. And we have a great power competitor who seeks to undermine the order that we've helped create, and frankly, that they've benefited along with other countries in the region. So the stakes are high. The Chinese have a vision and have aspirations that are contrary to what we would like the future of this region to be. And they're in the process of implementing a very comprehensive plan to achieve that end state of theirs. So we try to stress that it's extraordinarily consequential, and it requires action on our part, not complacency.
Gotcha. So you've spent a lot of time in your career, both State Department and in the Pentagon, focused on East Asia, focused on the Chinese problem, if you will. At least it's a problem now. If you would describe for us the focus of your effort when you served in the Pentagon as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific, what was a typical week like in that job? And what were your main goals?
So first of all, I would say I'm not sure any one week was the same as the previous or the next, but first of all, I travel a lot. So I was in the region not every other week, but pretty close, once every third week, because it is a pretty vast region, and wanted to make sure, in addition to our major allies, was also able to visit with emerging partners, including small countries in Southeast Asia, South Asia. So there was a great deal of travel. There were also some issues that became very hot, if you will. I spent a lot of time on the North Korea problem, traveled to Pyongyang a couple of times, traveled to the border at Panmunjom to support the negotiations for the summits that President Trump and Kim Jong-un held. Spent time on Afghanistan because we were involved in the early stages of the negotiation with the Taliban. But the one thing I would say is I wanted to have some degree of focus on the big challenge. And I had served in government before, and I understood that it was important that the urgent not drive out the important, and that you don't let the inbox really dominate your life. So I wanted to put out an Indo-Pacific strategy. We did. I wanted to change the structure of the office. We did. We renamed it Indo-Pacific Affairs. I was originally sworn in as Asia Pacific. We changed it to Indo-Pacific. I wanted to create a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the China competition piece. We did that. So I had a tremendous team, great support, but I was very intentional about keeping an eye on the big problem and the big challenge, so that we weren't totally overwhelmed by the inbox, including very important consequential issues in their own right, like North Korea. But really, I wanted to be able to say at the end of a couple years, we moved the ball forward with respect to our greatest challenge, which is the challenges presented by China.
I remember in October when you were a panelist on the during that day of the Russia-China conference. One of the things that you said that really struck with me, and I appreciated it, because the Naval Institute, I think, like your institute, is nonpartisan. You know, we're not a political organization. We're not, pro-Republican, Democrat, whatever. We're trying to seek the best answers, trying to foment the best conversation and discussion that will get to the right answers, and looking for, how do you tackle the tough challenges in the world militarily in the maritime domain. And one of the things that you said, which I really appreciated, was it's now been 2.5 at least administrations where the United States government has identified that China is a real problem. It is a national security challenge, and that sort of came to fruition, I guess, at the start or at the end of the second Obama administration. There was a discussion of the Pacific pivot, and people can say that maybe it wasn't as strong enough pivot as it needed to be, but there was that pivot. There was a focus that, hey, China is no longer a potential partner. They're more of a potential, if not already a real rival. And what they're trying to do is inimical to U.S. and allied interests. And then the Trump administration, and you served in that in the Pentagon in that administration. You had the 2018 National Defense Strategy. China called out as a peer rival, and put at the top of the list on the 5 most important national security challenges. China went to the top, right? And then you pointed out that the Trump administration left and the Biden administration took over, but the Biden administration didn't change that, right? That prioritization of China at the top of the list has stayed. And so that's important, I think, when people get excited about partisan politics and a lot of name calling and mud throwing and that kind of thing. When we can find consistency across policy and agreement across administrations of what the priorities are, that's when the United States government can kind of make some real progress. So I don't know if you wanted to elaborate on it at all, but I just thought that was a really salient point, and I wanted our listeners to hear that.
I always said that the Trump administration was more evolutionary than revolutionary when it came to the Indo-Pacific and the China challenge. And people would find that a little odd because it seemed like such a different administration, but that was mostly because of tone and style and how the leadership sort of portrayed our position in the region. But if you really look at the policy adaptations and things that we did, it very much was a continuation of the previous administration's work on the pivot, as you mentioned, and really leveraging a lot of the good work they did. The Obama administration was terrific on India and really laying the groundwork for a strategic partnership there. Southeast Asia, elevating the role of partners almost to a not quite equivalent, but a very important position next to our treaty allies. So I living it, I felt as though it was much more continuity than maybe the public perceived. And I think that's a reflection of a few things. I think, number one, we have enduring interests, and really our interests are what drive our policy decisions. Number two, it's that the behavior of China's growth, its strength in the region and its assertiveness is driving a lot of this. And three, it's the demand signal we're getting from allies and partners in the region that are asking for more U.S. involvement in a variety of ways, but very much to include our military presence, activities, exercises, relationships, our security assistance, very strong demand signals. So I do think it is more continuity, and I've been very supportive of the Biden administration. I think they've sharpened a lot of these tools. Look what they did on October 7th related to semiconductors, a very, I think, strong move with respect to export controls in a critical sector for us. So it's maybe surprising given the difference in style and tone, but I see a great deal of continuity.
Oh, that's great. We've got quite a few questions popping up into the chat window here from our online YouTube listeners. And so the first one, I want to take this one from Harry Lime, and I think this will get to some of the work that your organization does looking at open source Chinese language sources. But how do we know how the average Chinese person feels about Taiwan? I think that's a great question.
That is a very good question. And, it's a little difficult even reading the Chinese language materials because there's a tendency for people to sort of parrot what they've heard in their own media environment, what they're taught in schools. If you try to measure intensity, one gets the feeling that this is not an issue that the average Chinese are as passionate about as, for example, as distinct, for example, with Japan, which there's a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in China, which seems to be very deep felt and emotional and almost a visceral response. With Taiwan, there's a little more of a fascination. When the windows have opened for travel and Chinese tourists were able to go, there's a lot of interest in what is happening in Taiwan, what they've accomplished, seeing people that are of the same Chinese descent, even Taiwanese, if you go back centuries, are largely from the mainland, from Fujian area, to see what they've accomplished. And we know, tracking through social media, they comment on Taiwan's elections. They comment on things that from time to time will make the Chinese government and the CCP uncomfortable. Just one quick anecdote. The election of 2012 in Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, of the current president, was the DPP candidate who lost the 2012 election to the KMT incumbent president, Ma Ying-jeou. And the Chinese government decided to show her concession speech on Chinese state media in mainland China. And what they thought they were showing was the defeat of the pro-independence party, that their ideas about Taiwanese identity had been thoroughly voted down. And then the Chinese social media started to flare up about, wow, here is a woman of wealth and privilege who just lost a democratic election and has the grace and the good character to acknowledge defeat and support the government. And within hours, the Chinese had to shut all that down, of course. But there's a certain amount of admiration for what Taiwan has accomplished. Now, again, what you get through most Chinese sources we look at is a repeating of the mantras that they're taught. So it is a little difficult thing to measure. But I think as the question might imply, I think there is something there that we need to be aware of. If you look at the information space, for example, we talk a lot about, does Taiwan have the will to fight? I think we should be exploring whether or not China has the will to fight. Certainly it's an authoritarian system and they can direct the PLA to do this, but consider that this is a PLA comprised of all of them are only children, if you will.
Right.
And, do Chinese mothers want their sons to die for a Xi Jinping vanity project that may not be, as important to them as it is to the CCP leadership? Anyway, it's a great question. And it's something we'll continue to try to understand better.
No, I think that is a great question. I want to get back a little bit to U.S. government because you might be the first person that we've interviewed on this show who has served in both State Department and in, although now I take it back, Admiral Harris, after his retirement, served as the ambassador in Korea. We had him on the show a few months ago, but you were more at the coming up in both organizations and jumping from state to Pentagon and back and forth. And so, I'm curious your take. What are some relative strengths and weaknesses of the Department of State versus Department of Defense? And what were some cultural or procedural best practices that you tried to transplant from one to the other?
I could probably take more than the hour on this one. I always hasten to point out that the State Department I worked for was run by General Powell, Naval Academy grad Rich Armitage. My immediate boss was Naval Academy grad retiree Jim Kelly. But look, I love the State Department. The Foreign Service officers, the civil servants are every bit as patriotic and love their country and are mission-oriented the way that people who wear the uniform are. I think one thing that people forget is how small the Foreign Service is. We used to put in speeches for Secretary Powell, and I don't know if this is still true, but it was at the time. There are more military band members than there are Foreign Service officers. There's more U.S. military lawyers than there are Foreign Service officers. So this is a relatively small service, and then you spread that out from not only the Harry S. Truman headquarter building in D.C., but out through, I think it's something like 165 embassies, consulates, missions, and you get the point. It's a small service that's spread pretty thin. Yeah. I think culturally, what they do well is try to take as sophisticated understanding of interlocutors, both friends and foes alike. They're interested in their foreign counterparts in a way that really probably drove them to enter the service to begin with. They want that experience, and so a real deep understanding of interlocutors is something that I think from time to time is not matched in the uniformed services or in the Pentagon. I do think the State Department, we tried to have meetings start on time. We tried to have decisions come at the end of every meeting. There is a little bit more of an academic-y nature of that institution, which has its upsides. It can create a lot of creative thinking and problem solving. But sometimes, when you wear the uniform, you understand that, waiting for more information to come in can become counterproductive at some point. And,
Sure.
In the worst cases in the military can become lethal. But so I think the State Department has, for my liking, a bit of an academic culture. The Defense Department, it does drive decisions. It does have a mission-oriented mindset. Maybe some of the caricatures of rigidity are probably true, but I really found that I loved serving in both organizations. And if I could pass on anything to young people who are interested in government service, it's to be a good interagency citizen. Understand, your counterparts across the interagency, because it's really got to be one team, one fight. Particularly as you look at something like China. And by the way, not just State Department and Defense Department on China, but Treasury, USTR, Commerce. We all need to be rowing in the same direction. So having understanding and appreciation for your counterparts in the government is really important.
Yeah, great points about the interagency. So earlier, a couple of times I mentioned that you were part of this conference we had in October in Annapolis. And one of the discussion points of that day was lessons that China might be taking from the ongoing Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. So what do you think Xi Jinping and the Politburo in Beijing have learned or concluded so far from what's happening in Ukraine?
Hopefully they're learning that these things are hard.
Yeah.
The Russians occupied Crimea, parts of eastern Ukraine, Belarus as a satellite state. That's what I would call a bit of a running start. And you look at Taiwan, 80 nautical miles of water, mountainous, inhospitable terrain, unfavorable sea conditions, et cetera, et cetera. These things are hard, and I hope they harvest that. I'm sure the PLA professionals are understanding that. I don't know if that translates all the way to CCP top leadership. Hopefully it does. I think they're also looking at the reaction of the United States in ways that could both produce advantage for them as well as some concerns. They are looking very closely at our statements, including to the presidential level, about nuclear weapons in Russia and how that was a constraining factor for us. But they're also looking at the very impressive cost imposition that the United States helped lead after the invasion of Ukraine and what that might mean for China. Now, they know they have a bigger economy. They know they're a more diverse economy. Russia's a bit of a one-trick pony with energy. They know they're more integrated in the global supply chain. But they are concerned that the U.S. was able to marshal this international effort at cost imposition, and concerned about what they might face in the case of Taiwan. One other point, I think everyone on both sides of the strait, Taiwan and China, understand the importance of leadership in Ukraine. And, if President Zelensky did something similar to President Ghani and got on one of the first airplanes, this whole thing could look a lot different. His ability to continue to govern, to get on the airwaves, talk to the people of Ukraine, talk to the international community, pipe in virtually to allied and partner legislatures, critically important for the morale and the willingness of the Ukrainian people to fight. So that cuts both ways. Taiwan is looking at very carefully at continuity of government, and particularly communications, and how President Tsai or her successors could manage the same continuity of government and communications in a contested environment. And the PLA and CCP is probably looking at decapitation strategies at an early juncture in the conflict, understanding, again, the role that Zelensky has played in helping keep his people motivated in the fight. So they're harvesting the lessons as they're unfolding, and there are probably still more to come. But it is something that we should do our best to understand. And again, it's something our institute looks at very closely. And we have a project, in fact, coming up in terms of trying to understand the lessons that are being harvested on both sides of the strait.
That point about leadership and continuity of government and continuity of communications is a really salient one, Good point. I'm going to take a question from another one of our audience members, Ryan McDonald. He makes the point, in many ways, I feel the United States has built modern China through market access and investment. Can we expect a restriction of U.S. investment into China anytime soon? Thoughts on that?
Great point and good question. I mean, in many ways, we did help build the Chinese economy and help and as a result, indirectly contribute to military modernization there. That was based on a bet that integrating China into the global economy, giving them a seat at the table on regional international fora would start to shape how they viewed the region and the world, how they would see themselves as a participant in these matters, the so-called constructive participant. I'm getting the term wrong. Robert Zellick's famous characterization of China. Oh, responsible stakeholder.
Yes.
China as a responsible stakeholder. Theory being, once they're seated at the table, they understand that they hold equities as much as anybody in terms of preserving the status quo, and they would behave accordingly. Well, all of that turned out to be misjudgment or a misfire, if you will, on policy decisions, because we see that China has their own ambitions that are in contradiction with our own. So, reversing some of this is difficult. If you look at the degree to which we are integrated with China economically, it's pretty astounding. To say that we want to decouple is, it might be a directional statement, but it's not going to be easy. I think what we're likely to see, to get to the second part of the question, is some targeted decoupling. We saw the move on semiconductors, as I said, on October 7th. I think the next area that I hear members of Congress talking about, at least, would be biotech and the pharma community. Of course, we're highly reliant on China for pharmaceuticals and medicines in the United States. And in terms of investment, you will get the Congress looking at some restrictions on outbound investment from the United States to China. It seems to be one of the gaps. We did a inward investment reform in the last Congress, CFIUS reform, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, to try to tighten up controls on what China could invest in, what entities they could purchase in the United States. Nothing exists for the external outbound investment unless it's a clear, direct investment in a Chinese entity that is on one of our entities list. But the fact of the matter is that gets washed away if you invest in different investment platforms and vehicles. And that's basically what's happening. And U.S. capital is flowing into China at tremendous rates, which, again, indirectly will support military modernization given Chinese civil military fusion programs. So this is going to get a look. And we'll see what kind of outbound investment reviews can be constructed and how effective they'll be. But it won't be easy given the magnitude of our trade. And look, as my friend Mike Gallagher, the congressman from Wisconsin, said, I want to sell soybeans to China. I just don't want to sell them semiconductors. So we've got to figure out somewhere between soybeans and semiconductors where to fall on that. And that's a pretty wide spectrum.
No, that's a great point. I've also heard the term, and I've read it in some Wall Street Journal articles, that a number of companies are now having an ABC strategy, right? An anywhere but China strategy in terms of where they, build new plants, where they, how they diversify their supply chain, because of the COVID lockdowns, but also because of concern about, Xi Jinping taking on a third term and what that portends in terms of, very tight government control and, perhaps the political military tensions in the region as well. So
that's a good point. When it comes to new investment, we're seeing a lot of diversification into Vietnam, into Southeast Asia, in certain sectors into India. It's the sunken costs and all the investment that has gone into China and these supply chains that have been created that are creating the issue for us. And that's a huge amount. But you're exactly right. When it comes to new investments, there's a lot of risk in China. Frankly, there's a lot of costs and hidden costs that just market conditions alone make other places more attractive for manufacturing and the kinds of things that China used to excel at.
Great points. So I want to get to something that our listeners and readers are familiar with. We kicked off something called the Maritime Counterinsurgency Project back in the July issue of Proceedings. It examines China's hybrid or gray zone or insurgent efforts to assert sovereignty over the South China Sea. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the ideas of China's campaign, that gray zone campaign, as an insurgency, and what tools the U.S. and its allies can use to counter those efforts. And, did you have conversations about, China's behavior in the South China Sea when you were in your job as the Assistant Secretary?
We had a lot of conversations about it. It's a hard problem, and I'm intrigued by this notion of looking at it as an insurgency and therefore opening up the conversation about counterinsurgency strategies and campaigns that have been conducted in the past, both successful and maybe not as successful, because I think there are a lot of qualities that overlap there. But look, it's a hard problem because by definition, and when you're in the gray zone, you're trying to stay below some threshold that would cause a harsher reaction from the U.S. and allies and partners. So they're deliberately operating below a certain threshold. That makes it challenging. It's also challenging because you've probably heard the term salami slicing. The Chinese can go at this in a deliberate, incremental way and at times pull back. So, we sort of have to be right and vigilant for a long period of time, an enduring presence and level of activity, unfortunately. I think one thing we tried to do in the last administration is we said, look, it's not the color of the hull, it's the activity of the vessel. So we should not be confused by the mix of hulls in terms of PLA Navy, Coast Guard, maritime militia. If they're performing the duties of a military vessel in a mission to exert sovereignty in a legal, expansive way, it should be treated as such. So I think that's sort of part of it, is a shift in mentality that they don't get a pass because they're maritime militia. They have to be treated in accordance with what their mission is and their activity. I think the other big part of this is the allies and partners piece, and I think we're seeing progress in terms of an awakening, if you will, of the challenge and a willingness to be part of a collective response, even if not everybody contributes in the same ways. But growing interest in the maritime domain awareness piece, growing interest in being able to protect one's own sovereign claims and at least be able to monitor and shadow in their own sovereign areas. So if you're sitting in Beijing, I will grant that they are playing the long term. They're willing to go incremental. But since they've started the land reclamation projects in the South China Sea, where at least 7 or so low tide elevations have been built into islands and have been militarized with deployment of certain capabilities on those islands, what have they seen in response? An increase in U.S. freedom of navigation operations, an increase in the number of countries that are willing to do patrols in the South China Sea, even if it's short of a 12 nautical mile challenge. Diplomatic pressure through regional fora on, for example, ASEAN refusing to sign a code of conduct because of Chinese behavior. You've seen some amount of sanctioning and naming and shaming. When we kicked China out of RIMPAC, the Rim-Pacific exercise, Jim Mattis went public and said this is because of activities in the South China Sea. So he made it on point for that decision to remove China from RIMPAC. We talked a lot about potential cost imposition strategies. I will say there's some work to be done here. I used to get called to interagency meetings, and people would begin the meeting by almost pointing a finger at me and saying, FONOPS is not a strategy. FONOPS is a tactic. Okay, we got that out of the way. What do you got? What do you sanctions or other diplomatic or political activities? Not a lot. It's hard. So we need a little more creative thinking on how to respond to this. But I think in general, particularly the allied partner piece is moving in the right direction. So I'm relatively encouraged.
That's great. Well, we are unfortunately running out of time, and this has been just a fantastic conversation, and really appreciate your insights and what you're doing at the Project 2049 Institute to keep an eye and a focus on China and on East Asia and on the security threats that are out there, that are imminent out there. So my guest today has been the Honorable Randy Shriver, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, and now the chairman of the Project 2049 Institute. Randy, thanks for your time today and your expert insights.
My pleasure. Enjoyed the conversation.
Okay. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Proceedings podcast, brought to you by Blue Cross Blue Shield Vision Coverage. What makes good vision coverage? Things like fully covered vision exams for all members, access to over 125,000 independent providers and national retailers. That's why you should choose Blue Cross Blue Shield FEP Vision. Plans start as low as $12 a month. See what we can do for you at bcbsfepvision.com. If you enjoyed the show, like us, subscribe to our channel, tell your friends, become a member at usni.org/join. And until next episode, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.